Yo, what's going on everybody, Swagkage here, and welcome to today's video where we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite pale-skinned snake man, Orochimaru, one of many Naruto characters introduced during the Chunin exams that ended up being a mainstay in the cast up until the end of the series, though unlike many of the characters introduced during that arc, Orochimaru was a villain then and has remained a villain to this day. For the most part, anyway. What sets him apart from many of Naruto's other main villains is that Orochimaru is played completely straight. He's an unapologetic bad guy, a terrible person to the core with no redeeming qualities. Now, that by itself isn't enough to make him a unique character. There are plenty of straight villains out there in the vast world of fiction, but in this series in particular, I think it's enough to make Orochimaru feel distinct. That isn't to say that Naruto doesn't have its own fair share of other straight villains, but what sets Orochimaru apart from them is his very apparent complexity. He has a pretty simple goal, and that is to become immortal and master as many jutsu as humanly possible, but what led him to that goal and the way he pursues it is what makes him so interesting. Now, the series doesn't dwell on this too much, but it is stated that Orochimaru lost both of his parents when he was young. He's an orphan. It's sort of implied that the death of his parents hit him pretty hard, as it would any child, and now I believe that having to cope with this led him down a slippery slope, where he began to develop an extreme and unnatural bitterness towards the concept of death and human mortality overall. Now, the death of his parents on its own didn't push him over the edge. Like I said, that was just the push that sent him down the slope in the first place. Orochimaru probably saw plenty of other people die during his time as a shinobi in the Hidden Leaf. He fought in the Second Shinobi World War, after all. And we do know, based on the way Nagato speaks about that war, that it wasn't the most pleasant experience for everybody involved in it. A more direct and concrete example of the effects that this war may have had on Orochimaru is the death of Tsunade's lover Dan, which came shortly after the death of her little brother Nawaki, and as her squad mate, he was right there with her when she had to deal with both of these deaths. They hit Tsunade hard, and by extension I imagine they hit Orochimaru hard, as did many of the other deaths he had to witness while he was fighting as a member of the Leaf's military. Now, I know it is stated that Orochimaru had a pretty twisted and sadistic personality even as a little kid, but I'm pretty sure that his ties with his squad kept him a lot more warm and human than he was when he was first introduced in the Forest of Death. It's made apparent that Jiraiya really cared about this guy, so there was obviously some good buried deep in Orochimaru at some point. I think having people he was close to kept his insanity at bay, but eventually, whatever it was keeping him from acting like a maniac was eroded away. I think what caused him to slowly lose his humanity is a combination of what I just mentioned, the fact that he, over time, developed this very strong hatred for the concept of death, particularly due to the effects that it had on other people. But, interestingly, I also think that as Orochimaru slowly began to fear and despise death, he also grew progressively desensitized to it due to how much of it he had to see during the Second Shinobi World War. This also probably wasn't helped by the fact that, like many characters have said, Orochimaru seemed to be a bit of a weirdo from the start, so obviously somebody who hates the idea of mortality and dying more than anything else is going to be driven to attempt to prevent it. And pretty much anybody who knew Orochimaru claims that he was and has always been a genius, so I feel that he was aware that he had the tools at his disposal to, at the very least, start working towards a way to prevent people from dying. Now, over time, I believe that this pretty respectable and reasonable goal of discovering a way to prevent death devolved into a new goal that only involved Orochimaru discovering a way to make himself immortal, and I believe that this happened because of all of the terrible things Orochimaru had to do in his pursuit of this. Like I mentioned earlier, he had already been desensitized to the idea of death by the Second Shinobi World War, and I think that made it significantly easier for him to justify killing other people in the pursuit of finding a permanent cure for human mortality, but this caused him to lose his humanity over time, and eventually turned him into the monster that we know him as when he is first introduced. As his sanity continued to slip away from him, I believe Orochimaru continued further down this slippery slope until he reached a point where he was willing to do absolutely anything if it meant pushing him closer to completing this immortality jutsu. Then he continued even further down this slope until becoming immortal was no longer his only ambition, and he additionally wanted to learn how to master every possible jutsu under the sun. As this began to become a core part of his ambition, Orochimaru felt that it was justified to do all of the things he had been doing in the pursuit of immortality, but for a much more selfish purpose, that being to discover and create new potential jutsu. By the time he reached this point, Orochimaru had already resorted to things like kidnapping, murder, human experimentation, and a bunch of other horrible, cruel acts, all of which had completely devolved him into a shell of the person that he used to be. By the time Hiruzen discovered him performing human experiments in his underground lab, Orochimaru had become a completely different person. A self-serving madman with a god complex and a love for chaos. Between this point and the point at which we first see him during the series, I'm pretty sure he spiraled even further into insanity, as made evident by the fact that he has 4 different hideouts, all filled to the brim with living prisoners that he performs countless experiments on. His enormous ego and out-of-control god complex had also probably reached new heights, considering the fact that he assassinated the 4th Kazekage, Gaara's father Rasa, impersonated him to infiltrate the Chunin exams, and assassinated the 3rd Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, his former master, all because he thought it would be pretty funny. Then of course the way he speaks to and about Naruto makes it very apparent that Orochimaru doesn't really like people without talent, and considers he and prodigies like him above everybody else, or something along those lines, just based on the little speech he gives to Jiraiya during their fight in the 3-way deadlock. Now that's not to say Orochimaru hadn't earned his ego. By early part 1, Orochimaru had mastered all sorts of jutsu, including one of the most powerful kinjutsu in the whole series, the Impure World Reincarnation technique, which he was able to use to summon Hashirama and Tobirama, the guy who created the jutsu in the first place, in order to have them fight his former master as a form of psychological warfare. He went through all of the trouble to bring 2 of the most powerful shinobi who had ever lived back from the dead, just because he thought it would be funny to see Hiruzen's heart break at the thought of having to fight his 2 predecessors. The guy was a god among shinobi, who probably had over 1,000 jutsu at his disposal, much like Kakashi, but instead of copying them with the Sharingan the way Kakashi did, Orochimaru managed to learn and create all of these jutsu naturally. This brings me to my next point, which is going to involve discussing his obsession with the Sharingan and the Uchiha clan. Now, despite the fact that Orochimaru was well aware of how talented he was, he knew for a fact that no matter what jutsu he created, he would never be able to replicate the natural phenomenon that was the Sharingan. These eyes gave their owners access to some of the most fearsome abilities in the entire shinobi world, but because they were a Kekkei Genkai, Orochimaru had no way of accessing them. There are a whole lot of reasons why this was a problem for him. Not only was it impossible to access the Sharingan without either being born with them or having them implanted, but furthermore, all but 2 members of the Uchiha clan, to most people's knowledge anyway, had been killed off already. This meant that Orochimaru's only options for retrieving the Sharingan would be either to capture the body of Itachi Uchiha or the body of Sasuke Uchiha, both of whom were considered especially talented even among the universally prodigal members of the Uchiha clan. While Orochimaru could have simply killed Sasuke and implanted his Sharingan himself, or stolen some of the Sharingan from Danzo's collection, I'll use Kakashi as an example once again to explain why that's a bad idea. Orochimaru wanted to be able to use these eyes to their fullest extent, and without an Uchiha body, he wouldn't have been able to do that. Heck, Kakashi couldn't even deactivate the Sharingan, so trying to use these eyes without an Uchiha body provides pretty severe handicaps, and I know a limitation like that for somebody like Orochimaru just wasn't going to fly. This is a guy who always wants more, and I know for a fact that he wouldn't be satisfied settling for a handicapped pair of Sharingan. Because of this, and furthermore because of the fact that capturing Itachi Uchiha's body was completely out of the question, Orochimaru had no choice but to focus on capturing the body of Sasuke Uchiha, because of how important the Sharingan were to him, as they would allow him to develop new jutsu much more quickly, and acquiring the Sharingan is the first step towards acquiring the Rinnegan. Orochimaru ended up becoming obsessed with capturing Sasuke's body, and as everybody knows, this is what eventually led to his downfall. I think this character arc in particular, one where Orochimaru stubbornly continues and continues and continues to attempt to acquire the Sharingan for himself, despite the fact that he already had so much, speaks volumes about who he is. He could not stomach the feeling of inferiority towards the Uchiha that his lack of Sharingan created, and like I said, eventually became so obsessed with acquiring a full power pair of Sharingan that he put his life in so much danger that he was nearly killed by Sasuke, and once again nearly killed by Itachi. Admittedly, I do think that he was pushed to a point of desperation by the effects that the Reaper Death Seal had on his body and, well, I guess multiple bodies, but the lengths he went to and the sheer amount of danger he placed himself in, also he could acquire a pair of Sharingan, thoroughly communicates just how greedy, self-centered, and ambitious Orochimaru truly is. Not to say that I hate him for any of this. All of Orochimaru's flaws, aside from the fact that he's a complete and total psychopath, are pretty human and easy to understand, and I think they make him a far more three-dimensional and interesting character than he would have been without them. Now, a lot of his evil and malice seems to have faded away over the course of the 4th Shinobi World War and the years that followed it, but I don't really know enough about the person that Orochimaru has become to dedicate another segment to dissecting who he is now, so I think this is where I'm gonna go ahead and end the video. If you guys have any questions, of course, feel free to ask me in the comments below, and if you think I missed anything, or want me to address another aspect of his character, then by all means, ask me in the comments, and I'll do my best to reply there. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching the video all the way to the end. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and until my next video, I'll talk to you later. Swagkage out. Bye.